Now, Chelsea are edging closer to breaking the British transfer record to sign Moises Caicedo from Brighton. He's completed his medical ahead of a £115 million deal. It means it's the second time that they've spent over £100 million since the new owners took over. So, will they be breaching FFP rules? Now, football financial expert Dan Plumley joins us live to answer those exact questions. Good afternoon to you, Dan. So let's start with it. They've spent just under £900 million since Todd Boehly arrived. How can they afford that?
Yeah, good afternoon. I think affordability is not necessarily the issue in the grand scheme of the numbers. It's obviously the regulations that we're looking at, and you have to factor in not just the transfer money that's spent, but the transfer money that you receive for outgoings as well. Any wages associated with transfers in and out, and then obviously how we amortise that transfer over the course of the contract. And there's other things there as well around the money coming into the club from a revenue perspective through commercial sponsorships, any other outgoings it has, and also the COVID era of the pandemic and what we saw with the kind of relaxation of FFP as well. So it's not just as simple sometimes as looking at those transfer fees. We have to look at all those things in the mix, and that's what the eyes will be on around the scrutiny around affordability with these transfers.
So look, you've been looking at their profit and losses over the last few years. What does that tell us about where they are at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's where the scrutiny will be. They've made heavy losses in the last 2 years, 120 million, 150 million, profit in 2020 and a significant profit as well in 2018, and then a loss in 2019. So you've got that kind of volatility that we can see in a lot of football club accounts. But again, I think the bigger picture of that is, of course, that COVID real lockdown period during the pandemic, and what the governing bodies did with those regulations and what they allowed clubs to claim against, which we don't always see. And we only see the numbers that we can look at the bottom line. So it's easy to see why the eyes of scrutiny are there. But also in the backdrop of this as well, UEFA have changed their financial fair play regulations now to a new version of financial sustainability regulations, which came into play in June of 2022. So the regulatory goalposts have shifted in Europe as well a little bit, which is important to consider in the narrative here.
Yeah, so the fact that they've had to, I guess, let a lot of players go this summer, we obviously need to consider that when analysing their financial sustainability. But are they sustainable, do you think?
In terms of from a club overall and from the ownership structure sat behind it, yes, I think is the blunt answer. But in terms of a regulatory framework, you're absolutely right. We have to look at those numbers and how they affect the bottom line. And that's what the governing bodies will be looking at, the Premier League and UEFA, of course. But we do have to consider both sides of the coin. The money spent is one argument to that we need to look at, but the outgoings as well. And again, not just the transfer fees of the outgoings, which, reported there around 232 million, but also the money that's been shifted off the wage bill and the amortisation charges linked to that as well, which Chelsea will gain back. So as always, it's a much more complex picture than just looking at the net spend element to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we don't always know the wages, perhaps quite rightly, but Caicedo is expected to sign this 8-year deal, isn't he? So it spreads the fee over a longer time. Is this still risky, or is that a better way of doing business?
I think from a financial side of things, a lot of people will look at that as a clever business strategy, and we've seen UEFA kind of already close that loophole. It's clearly looking at a cost control measure from a financial side of things and how you book the transfer. I think from a playing side of things, there's still a lot of risk in that strategy as well, because as is the way with football, the players are only one game away from a really bad injury, which can hamper their future value or can hamper the amount that they can play in the current team that they're in. You've got decisions about future values further down the track, so it does allow for Chelsea to be able to do a lot within the scope of their own books at the minute and how they record those transfers. But I still think there's inherent risk in the strategy from a playing perspective in signing players on longer deals, and that's probably the reason why other clubs haven't done that in the past, and we're seeing something different here with Chelsea in the market right now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see whether other teams will start to follow suit. I mean, the football earnings rule has increased considerably, hasn't it? So how much extra spending power does that give the bigger clubs, the wealthier clubs?
Yeah, so this is linked to, as I say, UEFA's new regulations, now titled Financial Sustainability Regulations. And again, I don't think we're perhaps talking about that enough, but essentially when you look at the break-even principle of that, it used to be for UEFA's competitions, you could lose up to 30 million euros over 3 seasons. That's effectively been doubled now. So the loss is 60 million over 3 seasons that's permissible. And, that creates, again, another decision for clubs to make. And it's only clubs that conform and play in UEFA's competitions, which is another factor for Chelsea here, obviously. They expect to be back in Europe moving forward. But it does give clubs a decision to make. So, you can spend a little bit more than you could before. And also, as we know, that will benefit the bigger clubs as always.
Nearly £1 billion in 3 transfer windows since Todd Boehly arrived. I mean, that's an incredible amount of money. We didn't think potentially that was going to happen after the previous ownership and they all left. But he's backed them as well. He backs every manager. And they've got a top manager in Mauricio Pochettino. I think they need silverware. And I think they will be competing for the top 4, 100%.
Mark, Darren's just touched on it there. Nearly £1 billion spent. How can they do this with the words FFP floating around in the ether?
Yeah, well, this is the big question. So many football fans will be sat back going, how can Chelsea spend this amount of money? FFP is a very complex way that they work out what you can spend on transfers, wages, and so on and so forth. Obviously, owners can put money into the football club. It all goes against how much you generate in income as well. And obviously, Chelsea have been in the Champions League over the last few years, so they do have that income. They won the competition, which generated around 120 million alone under Thomas Tuchel when he first went into the football club. And they are done in 3-year trenches and 1-year accountancy periods as well. So there's 2 ways that they look at the finance. We knew that in June, Chelsea were keen to offload as many players as they possibly could before July the 1st, because all of those player sales went into the previous accounting year, whereas anyone that they buy after July the 1st goes into the next accountancy period. So now effectively they've got, 11 months to balance the books again. So they could spend as much as they wanted in this window, but providing when they get to the end of the next financial year, which will be June the 30th, they have made the player sales that they think they'll make, they then have the ability to balance things off and make sure that they are within the FFP guidelines. And
go on, sorry, Mark.
I was just going to say, the other thing to point out, and this is something that Darmesh has mentioned, Chelsea have given long contracts to young players. They have a very, very young average age squad there. You saw what Mauricio Pochettino did with the Tottenham squad. He took a young group on a journey. You get the feeling he's doing something very similar at Chelsea. And with this black cloud that's currently hanging over the football club, if they were to be sanctioned because of the financial breaches that they are being investigated for, and they were, say, penalised, not able to go into the market, not able to bring in players, transfer embargoes, they'll sit back a little bit more relaxed and go, well, actually, look at all that business that we did in the summer of 2023, in January 2023. We spent a lot of money. We've got young players, so we don't have to worry too much because we are taking this squad on a journey. So that may be their thinking.
That said, Darren, does that mean Chelsea are being really smart here? It's a really good business model.
Well, they've got a good team. They've got good players. So, yeah, potentially. I know the rules were spoken about changing, only giving out 5-year contracts. It's obviously not happened. So they're offsetting their balance and their money over a long period of time. And, of course, that is clever because you can get the players that you want through the door without breaking any rules. The craziest thing is, though, is all this money being spent, they've still not really sorted out the number 9 for them. They've obviously got Nicholas Jackson, look good. He'll score goals. They've got Nkunku still to come back. Is that enough for them to get back to where they want to be and challenge for the title? I'm not sure it is.
Well, one thing I would say, picking up on what Mark was saying about the whole FFP situation, it's easy to forget how much outgoing business Chelsea have done in this transfer window. And people say, well, how can they've generated all that money? I'll point to Mason Mount and Kai Havertz just in 2. That's 120 million, the thick end of it already. You've got Ruben Loftus-Cheek, who went for close to 30 million to AC Milan. Christian Pulisic as well. You had the players that went to Saudi Arabia. And if you take away all of those players and the wages they were on, that's a huge saving that Chelsea are making, both in transfer fees and in wages as well. So that will contribute to how that they can go about their business and comply with financial fair play rules as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's